Yeah, and all of us have that person in sports. Any of us who are passionate sports fans and have been with a particular team through the ups and downs and all of that, when you're a kid, you gravitate to one player. It just happens. You have a favorite player, and you have a favorite player on your team in different sports. And for most Mets fans that grew up in that era, it was always Tom Seaver. I mean, that's why, he got the nicknames that he got. That's why, he was the first person always, if the Mets were celebrating a big moment, that would get a call to come back. I mean, not having seen Seaver in his prime or really pitch for the Mets at my age, still seeing him in person the couple of times that I did, you understood what it meant. I mean, there was a couple of things that, being raised a Mets fan, you were told immediately. And a lot of those things were Tom Seaver related, right? Like, this guy was the baddest dude on the planet. That was number one. And also, him getting traded away in 1977 was one of the worst feelings that anybody ever had. And, those were the things that you were taught. So I remember when they closed Shea Stadium, and this was just a miserable, miserable sports day. Yeah. I think everybody remembers it was the second straight collapse, another loss. The last game of the season, they couldn't hit, and then they had to close the stadium. And I remember the seats that we had for that game, we had for a number of times that year. And it was down the right field line. I don't know if you remember how Shea was constructed, where they would, in field level, right down the right field line. It really kind of went right up to the line there where the right fielder was. So that's where we were sitting, and the doors opened up from center field, and here comes Piazza and Seaver to close the stadium. And, of course, I'm sitting there, I'm crying, I'm blubbering like a fool, because it meant more to me. And I always say that when the doors closed on Shea, when Piazza and Seaver walked through there, my Mets fandom was never going to be the same. It just wasn't. I was at a certain age. That building I had so many memories in was now going to be no more. So it was just that was like a moment where I'll never forget. But just seeing those two together and knowing what they meant to the franchise in different ways, one being able to deliver a championship, the other not, but many, many great moments. When you saw them, there's just certain people that have that different aura.
Larger than life.
Yeah, and he was 100% that. And then it's funny because when you mentioned the way that Boomer had come back and he was acting like a kid, so watching this interview back in 2012, they were doing the 50th anniversary of the Mets, and they were running back some of that stuff on SNY last night, and it was Burkhart, Howie Rose, and Gary Cohen with Tom Seaver interviewing him. And at the end of the interview, when he stood up and shook their hands, I'd never seen the looks on the faces of Howie Rose and Gary Cohen, and I was going to bring that up, and you said the same thing about Boomer. It's like these guys, they instantly turn into 10-year-old boys again when they are around him, and that's the impact that he had.
Yeah, no doubt. And, Boomer, obviously, big impact. The other one for me, because I spent so much time with him, was Joe. I mean, Joe would talk about, Beningo I'm talking about, would discuss Seaver at length, and he would always talk about the trade. And, if a caller would call in on the overnight or even middays, whatever, and you worked with them all for a lengthy time too, they'd mention Seaver, and he'd immediately go to the trade, and one of the worst days of his life, and, at least sports-wise anyway. And so he just meant a lot to a lot of people in that age bracket, and understandably so. You look at the career he's had, and he was something. You look at the complete – I know it's a different time. I get it. The complete games, though, the wins, the ERA, just spectacular. He's one of those players, and there's, everybody's got a select few. There's one of those players you wish you were, old enough to see. For me, not old enough, not quite at the end. It's interesting, too, and I read this. I don't know why I didn't realize this until this morning. Mets, Reds, White Sox, all good. Did you realize he was still a member of the Red Sox for the 86 World Series? I did not. I don't know why I didn't know that. That was his last year. I guess he won 4 or 5 games with them, but he was in the clubhouse, according to the article. I never realized that I, for some reason, thought he was released prior to the postseason that year. I remember he was there. I do remember that. I didn't know he was still with them, though, during that World Series. It was interesting.
That's one I had totally forgotten about. Same thing here when I read it. I said, wow, I mean, that is – and this is another one of these things where it seemed like the Mets and Seaver after 1969 were always missing each other with big moments. So, for example, he throws his no-hitter with the Reds, his first no-hitter with the Reds. He gets his 300th win with the White Sox. The Mets win the World Series in '86 when Seaver is still an active player and he's on the opposing team. And that was the thing that was so frustrating with the Mets and Tom Seaver at that time for Mets fans was he should have never gone anywhere else. All these things needed to happen when he was in a Mets uniform. I mean, still, the good outweighs the bad by a million, but it's just frustrating to see those things. And the 300th game one, like the trade was, we see lots of legendary players get traded away when a franchise feels like they need to rebuild. Of course, it wasn't the right move. The haul wasn't good enough. He still had a lot left in the tank. It worked out great for him, Tom Seaver, that is, when he went to the Reds. But, the one that's even more infuriating is that whole leaving him unprotected in, what was it, 1983.
When he goes to Chicago.
And thinking Frank Cashin's like, whatever, they're not going to take Seaver. There's no way. Why would they take Seaver? Seaver's our guy. They're not going to take him. So they end up taking him, and then he wins his 300th game as a member of the White Sox in some of the ugliest uniforms you'll ever see in your life. And that's one of those things that if sports talk was around in 1983, in 1977 with the trade like it is today.
Could you imagine? Oh.
I mean, we'd still be taking calls on it.
Well, you would, because it kind of like what we're talking about, the way that guys like Joe and Boomer talk about him. I mean, that was their guy. They would have been, and they were. If it was sports talk radio back then, my God, the lines would be on fire, right? I mean, think about the calls you would have. It'd be nonstop. You had 6 lines going, one after the other. Just, next caller, go. Next caller, go, because the fury, I can only imagine what it was like back then. And he was here, another thing, too, is he was here a long time. I'd love to go back and find out the reasons for the trade. I know he was in his early 30s. I wonder if there was some thought that they had gotten the best of him already and moving on. But, again, that's so long ago.
I mean, it was a contract situation is what it is.
Understood. So, but you're still at an age back then where I would think, you know what, maybe you're thinking contract, he wants more money, he's 32. Who knew he still had so many more years left in the tank?
I just think that ownership and management at the time was just deemed extremely cheap. Just from what I gathered, it was a heartless, cheap group that did not care about anything other than the bottom line and was not connected to the fan base, which is why I think the Wilpons get sort of the rap that they get, right?
Sure.
It's because Mets fans have been burned by that type of mentality before, and they believe that the current ownership group has that type of mentality and has had it for a number of years. So that's why, Mets fans are really stung by those things. But, yeah, I mean, that's just brutal. I mean, and to think, 8 years after the 69 championship, seems like, 8 years is almost a decade. It seems like a long time. But in the grand scheme of things in somebody's career, 8 years after that is really not that long when a guy pitched 19 years,
right?
Almost 20 years in Major League Baseball. So, you're talking about, 8 years removed from that. And then it's not like he wasn't. He was great. He was winning Cy Youngs. He was spectacular in the early 70s and beyond. So, trading him at that time, I can understand how it ripped the heart and ripped the guts out of Mets fans. You really, this does happen, as I mentioned before, with certain players, but that one always seemed to me, when I would look back at the history of it, ill-timed, too soon, all of those things. That's the hero, right? That's, that would have been like when Kobe wanted that extra contract at the end of his career that the Lakers would have traded him away to the Atlanta Hawks. Teams don't do that. You just don't do that type of stuff, and the Mets did, and Met fans will never forget it.
Yeah, and more so, and even worse, because 32, not 39. Kobe
exactly.
at the end was at the end.
Exactly.
Tom Seaver was not at the end when he was dealt.
Sure.
But 32. For me, it was Strawberry and Herschel Walker. Those are the two guys that even as a 46-year-old, Obviously Darryl's had his issues off the field, as we know, and many times over he has had his issues, but I think he's on the straight and narrow now. At least it seems that way. And Walker I've always been a fan of. Even though he was a Cowboy only for, a handful of years, the effort that guy gave every day just instantly became one of my guys. Like those two for me, when that day comes, that'll be like this for a lot of Met fans. Like,
sure.
Those were two. And that's it. It's those two and those two only.
Yeah, I mean, it was different for me, those 80s Mets, because I was still, I missed 86 because I was 4, and that was a tough one. But my first sports memory, I always say, was just set me up for the rest of my sports memories, was them losing in 1988. Like, sure. I vividly remember them losing the NLCS in 1988 is my first sports memory, and crying about it as a 6-year-old. But, it was always Gary Carter and Keith Hernandez. Those two guys I loved. And it was hard for me to decide which one I liked the best in that group.
Right.
And then, obviously, I was older. I mean, I was in high school when Piazza came over in that trade. And, of course, he wasn't a homegrown Met. And I always loved Edgardo Alfonso. I mean, I absolutely loved him. Like, he was just something, how steady he was. He went about his business. Like, he was just the man to me. I loved Edgardo Alfonso. But to me, it's so funny because the guy that stands out more than anybody for me in sports as that guy was John Randall of the Minnesota Vikings.
Right.
And I had that moment of meeting him and interviewing him at the Super Bowl, and I was caught in between this hatred that was still existing from 20 years earlier between him and Boomer.
Yeah, weird spot for sure.
Think about that. So, I'm through the roof giddy like a little boy meeting this guy that I absolutely love, and then I got Boomer, who I respect
taking
more
shots.
than anybody, who's a friend and a colleague, hates his guts because he's saying he's a dirty player.
Yes.
I was like, oh,
you remember,
no.
John, when you came at my knees that day?
Oh, that was horrible.
Yes.
I didn't know what to do. I was stuck between. I didn't know who to defend.
Exactly what you did. That's what you do.
Yeah, but I mean, it's, of course, everybody has one of those guys. So this was a tough one. And the other thing, I don't want to focus on the negatives on a day like this because you don't. But, of course, this popped in my mind. The Seaver statue should have been up long ago.
Yeah.
It should have been up long ago.
It's been something that's been discussed for 10, 12, 20 years. You're absolutely right. And it's a shame he's not going to be here to see it. You're absolutely right.
And a lot of people because he publicly put out there, him and the people around him, that he was retiring from public life, I believe is how it was put. And at that point, a lot of us, maybe we didn't say it, maybe some did, we thought exactly that. We thought, well, this Seaver statue is going to take a little bit of time to get done, and he's probably not going to be able to come back to see it, but hopefully he'll still be around to see it. And now you don't have any either one of those things.
I think the hope was, while that was the statement, I think the hope was that maybe get here for one more time. And unfortunately, that's not to be the case. You're right. It absolutely took too long. It is something that had been talked about. They finally got around to doing it. And for him, unfortunately, too late.
Yeah, and I don't know the relationship there. I've heard lots of things between the Wilpons and Seaver and how there's been some issues when they want to have him come back and this and that. But I don't know these things to be facts. And all I do know is that, Tom Seaver absolutely loved being a Met. He loved it. There was no question about it. He might have not had the greatest relationship with the current owners, but he loved being a Met. He never wanted to leave when he got traded. His memories of that 69 World Series, of what Gil Hodges meant to him and his teammates and Kuzman and so on and so forth, meant so much to him. And that's what you can really look back on, with his career and the type of guy that he was. I mean, I don't hear lots of bad interactions with Tom Seaver. And he spent a couple years in the broadcast booth, too. That's where I really got to know his personality, is watching all those Met games when he was calling them in the late 90s and the early 2000s. I mean, I didn't know much about his personality at that point, and then, learned about it. But this guy loved the Mets. He did. He doesn't have a bad word, really, to say about his time with the Mets and wanted to be there for his entire career.
Always have 1969. Never going anywhere.
Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to hit the red bell so you're notified when we have new content.